It was a bright morning in a small, quiet town where life moved at a leisurely pace. The sky stretched clear and blue above the modest rows of buildings, and the air carried the aroma of fresh brewed coffee from a tiny roadside shack. Terence King, a man of 34, leaned against his car, dressed casually in a faded hoodie and well-worn sneakers that spoke of a life more practical than pretentious. Terence wasn't just any man. He was a federal inspector, though his unassuming demeanor and laid-back outfit gave no hint of his impressive credentials. He had just wrapped up a long, grueling week of work and sought nothing more than a peaceful morning with a cup of black coffee in hand. As Terence waited for his coffee, his mind drifted, savoring the rare, quiet moment. He barely noticed the squad car that pulled into the lot until it screeched to a halt, breaking the tranquility. The sudden noise snapped him out of his thoughts, and he danced over, his eyes narrowing slightly. Out stepped a white police officer, a man built like a linebacker, wearing a badge that gleamed in the sunlight and a smug expression that made it clear he saw himself as the authority here. Officer Bradley Hunter, his name stitched neatly onto his uniform, had a reputation in town for being both meticulous and overbearing, particularly when he felt his power was being questioned. "Hey, you!" The officer barked, his finger pointing directly at Terence. Terence's eyebrows shot up in mild surprise. "Me?" he asked, his voice polite but cautious. "You heard me," Hunter snapped, his tone leaving no room for misunderstanding. "Show me your ID." Terence was no stranger to moments like this. Being a black man in America often meant carrying an unspoken weight, the constant awareness that he might be judged, questioned, or dismissed simply because of the color of his skin. But even so, something about Officer Hunter's tone and the way his hand hovered near the butt of his gun set Terence's nerves on edge. He remained calm, his years of experience teaching him that anger only escalated situations like this. "Is there a problem, officer?" Terence asked, keeping his voice measured. "You're acting suspicious," Hunter said, stepping closer. His eyes scanned Terence like he was looking for something, anything, that would justify the hostility in his approach. Terence's first instinct was disbelief. Suspicious. For what? Waiting for coffee? But he didn't voice his thoughts. Instead, he reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and retrieved his wallet. He'd learned that every movement in these encounters mattered. "Here's my ID," he said, extending it toward Hunter. But Hunter wasn't satisfied with simple compliance. He snatched the wallet with unnecessary force, rifling through it like he expected to find evidence of some hidden crime. Then, with an exaggerated motion, he dumped its contents onto the ground. Credit cards, receipts, and a few folded bills scattered across the pavement. "Oops," Hunter said, smirking as he straightened up. Terence's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay composed. "Was that really necessary?" he asked, his tone steady but firm. Hunter leaned in closer, his smirk widening. "You got a problem with how I do my job?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Maybe you'd like to come downtown and discuss it." Terence stared at him, realizing that moment that this wasn't about anything he'd done. It was about who he was, or more accurately, who Hunter assumed he was. The weight of frustration pressed down on him, but he refused to let it show. "I haven't done anything wrong," Terence said, his voice calm but resolute. "Resisting now, huh?" Hunter sneered. Without waiting for a response, he spun Terence around, forcing his hands behind his back. The cold steel of handcuffs bit into his wrists, and Terence felt a wave of humiliation wash over him as Hunter marched him toward the SWAT car. Nearby, a few bystanders had begun to gather, their expressions a mix of shock and unease. Some pulled out their phones to record the scene. One woman called out, "He didn't do anything." "Mind your business," Hunter growled, shooting her a glare as he shoved Terence into the back seat. The drive to the station was tense, silent except for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Terence's mind raced. He thought of his family, his friends, his career. He thought of how a moment like this, rooted in assumptions and abuse of power, could ripple outward, affecting everything he worked so hard to build. At the station, Hunter paraded him inside as if he were some high-profile criminal. The fluorescent lights were harsh, casting an unflattering glare over the peeling paint and dingy walls. The smell of stale coffee and desperation hung heavy in the air. "Name?" the desk officer asked, barely looking up as Terence was shoved toward the booking desk. "Terence King," he said through clenched teeth. "Charges?" the desk officer asked, her turn bored. Hunter grinned, clearly enjoying himself. "Resisting arrest. Disturbing the peace. Acting suspicious." Terence let out a dry, incredulous laugh. "Suspicious for waiting for coffee." Hunter's grin faltered for a split second before he gave Terence a hard shove toward the holding cells. "Keep talking, buddy. You'll make this real easy for the judge tomorrow." The cell was cold and cramped, the walls covered in graffiti that told stories of frustration, anger, and despair. Inside, 2 other men glanced up as Terence was pushed inside. One was a wiry young man with wide eyes, the other a burly figure covered in tattoos. They exchanged knowing looks, recognizing a fellow victim of the system's unfairness. "What they get you for?" the younger man asked quietly. "Ordered coffee," Terence replied, his voice dry. The burly man chuckled. "Figures. They'll arrest you for breathing funny if you're the wrong shade of skin." As Terence settled onto the cold bench, his mind churned with emotions, anger, humiliation, and a deep determination to see this through. He knew the truth would come out eventually, but the road to justice was rarely easy. And for now, he was just another man in a cell, waiting for a chance to reclaim his dignity. What Terence didn't know was that this wasn't just another wrongful arrest. This was about to become something much bigger, a confrontation that would shake the system and expose truths that some would rather keep hidden. But as he sat there, staring at the graffiti-covered walls, all he could do was wait for the next chapter to unfold. The cold air in the cell seemed to seep into Terence's bones as he sat there, his hands still sore from the cuffs. He leaned back against the wall, trying to make sense of what had just happened. This wasn't his first encounter with prejudice. It came with the territory of being a black man in a world where assumptions often overshadow facts. But this time felt different. It wasn't just the arrogance of Officer Hunter or the humiliating arrest. It was the nagging sense that this was more than a simple abuse of power. Terence glanced at the 2 men sharing the cell with him. The younger one, skinny and jittery, kept looking toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. The older man, with tattoos running up his neck, sat calmly on the bench, his arms crossed, observing everything with an almost detached amusement. "You look like you're used to this," Terence said, breaking the silence and nodding toward the older man. The man chuckled, his deep voice echoing slightly in the small cell. "Yeah, you could say that. Cops around here don't need much of a reason to throw us in. Got a bit of a reputation for it." The younger man piped up, his voice trembling slightly. "They got me for jaywalking. I wasn't even crossing the street. I was just standing near the curb." He shook his head, frustration etched into his face. It's like they just make it up as they go. Terence nodded, his own anger simmering beneath the surface. "That officer," he said, his voice low but steady. He seemed eager, like he was looking for a reason. "Hunter?" the older man asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, he's bad news. Always throwing his weight around, especially if he thinks he can get away with it." Terence leaned forward slightly, curiosity mixing with his frustration. "Is he always like this, targeting people for no reason?" The man shrugged. "Pretty much. But it's not just him. It's the whole system around here. They look out for their own. You try to fight back, and they'll just make it worse." That thought weighed heavily on Terence. He had seen corruption before, in small ways and big. His job as a federal inspector often brought him face to face with systems that didn't work as they should, people who bent the rules to suit their agendas. But being on the receiving end of it, being treated like a criminal for doing absolutely nothing wrong, it hit differently. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an hour. Terence thought about his career, about how much he had worked to get where he was. He had dealt with his fair share of challenges, but he had always believed that the truth would prevail, that doing the right thing mattered. Now, sitting in this grimy cell, he couldn't help but wonder if that belief was misplaced. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hall, drawing the attention of everyone in the cell. A guard appeared, carrying a tray of food. He shoved it through the slot at the bottom of the cell door without a word. The smell hit Terence immediately. A mix of stale bread and something vaguely resembling meat. The younger man wrinkled his nose and pushed the tray toward the center of the cell. "I'm not eating that," he muttered. "Smart choice," the older man said with a chuckle, though he didn't seem particularly bothered by the offering. Prison food's not exactly Michelin-star quality. Terence ignored the tray, his mind elsewhere. He thought about the people who had witnessed his arrest. He hoped that at least one of them had captured enough on their phones to tell the real story. Evidence was everything. Without it, it would be his word against Hunter's, and he knew how those kinds of battles usually ended. "Why'd you even come here?" The older man asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "This town doesn't seem like your kind of place." Terence looked over at him, considering how much to say. "I was just passing through. Stopped for coffee. That's all." The man nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he already suspected. "Well, you picked the wrong place for a pit stop, my friend." Terence smirked faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out." Hours seemed to stretch endlessly. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the occasional sound of distant voices or the slam of a door punctuated the monotony. Terence closed his eyes, trying to focus, trying to remind himself that this wasn't the end. He had faced challenges before, though none quite like this. The key was to stay calm, to play the long game. He had to trust that the truth would come out, even if the system seemed stacked against him. Eventually, the door to the holding area slammed open again. Officer Hunter strolled in, his expression smug as ever. He looked at Terence, then at the other two men in the cell, as if deciding whether to say anything. "King," Hunter finally said, his tone sharp. "Get up. Judge wants to see you first thing in the morning. Better get some rest." Terence stayed seated for a moment, meeting Hunter's gaze evenly. "Rest? In here?" he asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. Hunter's smirk widened. "You're lucky you're not in solitary. Keep that attitude, and I might reconsider." Terence stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He didn't want to give Hunter the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. As Hunter turned to leave, Terence spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "You're making a mistake, and when the truth comes out, you're going to regret this." Hunter paused in the doorway, glancing back over his shoulder. "The truth?" he repeated, his tone mocking. "The truth is, you're just another punk who thinks the rules don't apply to him. But don't worry. I'll make sure the judge sees you for what you really are." With that, he left, the heavy door slamming shut behind him. Terence sat back down, his jaw tight with anger. The older man in the cell let out a low whistle. "Man's got a chip on his shoulder the size of this whole town," he said. "You better be ready for whatever he throws at you." "I am," Terence replied, his voice steady. "I've dealt with people like him before." The older man gave him a long look, then nodded. "Good. Just make sure you don't let him get under your skin." "That's what he wants." Terence didn't respond, but the man's words lingered in his mind. He knew he had to stay focused. Tomorrow would be the first step in clearing his name, and he couldn't afford to lose his cool. But as he leaned back against the wall, staring at the graffiti-covered ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Something bigger was at play, and he was caught in the middle of it. The hours before sunrise were the hardest. Sleep didn't come easy in a place like that, and Terence wasn't about to let his guard down. The younger man in the cell dozed fitfully, his legs twitching now and then, while the older man remained awake, leaning against the wall with an air of practiced indifference. Terence envied the calm but couldn't match it. His mind churned, replaying every detail of his arrest, every word spoken, every subtle look exchanged. He thought about Officer Hunter's smug grin, the casual way he had tossed Terrence's wallet to the ground like it meant nothing. It wasn't just humiliating, it was calculated. Hunter wanted to send a message, one that went beyond a simple show of authority. Terrence had encountered people like Hunter before, men who thrived on control, who wore their power like armor. But there was something more here, something that didn't sit right. Terrence's instincts had served him well over the years. They had to. His job demanded it, being able to read people, to notice the small details others might miss. That same instinct was now screaming at him, warning that this wasn't just a random act of bigotry or a bad cop on a power trip. There was an edge to Hunter, a specific kind of malice that felt personal, even if Terrence couldn't figure out why. The older man finally spoke, his deep voice cutting through the heavy silence. "You're not just some guy who stopped for coffee, are you?" Terrence glanced over, meeting the man's eyes. There was no judgment there, just curiosity and a hint of knowing. "What makes you say that?" The man shrugged, a faint smirk playing at his lips. "You're too calm. Most people would be freaking out by now, yelling about lawyers or calling someone to bail them out. But you're sitting there like you're planning your next move." Terrence didn't respond immediately. He weighed his options, considering how much he should reveal. Finally, he said, "Let's just say I've been in situations where keeping a cool head was the only way out." The man nodded, seeming satisfied with that answer. "Well, if you're playing the long game, you better be ready. Guys like Hunter, they don't back down easy." Terrence let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Neither do I." Morning came faster than Terrence expected. The sound of keys jangling snapped him out of his thoughts. A guard appeared, his face a mask of indifference, as he unlocked the cell. "King," he said, gesturing for Terrence to step forward. "Time to go." Terrence stood, stretching his stiff muscles. The older man gave him a slight nod, a silent wish of good luck. The younger man, still half asleep, muttered something incoherent as Terrence stepped out of the cell. The guard cuffed his wrists again, the metal cold and unforgiving against his skin. The walk to the courtroom was quiet, the only sound the echo of their footsteps in the empty hallway. Terrence's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. He knew better than to let anyone see his nerves. Perception was everything, especially now. When they entered the courtroom, Terrence's eyes immediately landed on Officer Hunter. He was sitting at the prosecution's table, his smug grin firmly in place. Next to him was a man Terrence assumed was the prosecutor, flipping through a stack of papers with practiced disinterest. Across the room, a public defender sat at a worn wooden table, looking even more frazzled than the night before. Terrence was guided to the defense table and sat down, his cuffs clinking softly against the chair. The judge entered moments later, an older woman with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She called the court to order, her voice firm and commanding. The prosecutor began, laying out the charges against Terrence: resisting arrest, disturbing the peace, and an ambiguous claim of acting suspicious. As Hunter took the stand to give his testimony, Terrence watched him closely, analyzing every word, every gesture. Hunter painted a picture of a defiant, uncooperative man, a narrative designed to justify his actions and obscure the truth. But as Hunter spoke, something shifted. The prosecutor, who had seemed indifferent at first, began to glance at Hunter with subtle curiosity, as if picking up on inconsistencies in his story. It was a small crack, but Terrence latched onto it, hoping it would widen. When it was Terrence's turn to speak, he kept his tone measured, his words deliberate. He described the events of the previous day calmly, without exaggeration. He emphasized his compliance, his confusion at being targeted, and the unnecessary escalation by Hunter. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as he spoke, the tension palpable. Then came the moment Terrence had been waiting for, the introduction of the surveillance footage from the coffee shop. The prosecutor presented it with a neutral expression, but as the video played, The courtroom fell silent. The footage showed Terence standing calmly by his car, followed by Hunter's aggressive approach and subsequent actions. It was undeniable, the truth laid bare for all to see. The judge leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing as she turned to Hunter. "Officer, do you have an explanation for this?" he asked, Artemisi. Hunter stammered, his confidence faltering for the first time. I believed he was a threat," he said weakly, but the words lacked conviction. The judge's gaze didn't waver. "A threat. From what I see, Mr. King was compliant and posed no danger. Your actions, on the other hand, are deeply concerning." As the courtroom buzzed with whispered reactions, Terence allowed himself a small breath of relief. The tide was turning, but he knew this wasn't over. The real fight was just beginning, and he was ready for it. The judge's words hung heavy in the courtroom, the tension so thick it felt like no one dared to breathe. Officer Hunter, once so smug and confident, now shifted uneasily in his seat. His polished badge seemed to dull under the weight of the scrutiny. Terence watched him carefully, the subtle cracks in his facade growing more obvious with every passing second. The prosecutor, who had been uncharacteristically silent during the judge's questioning, cleared his throat and stood. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, but with an edge of hesitation, "I believe it's in the court's interest to delve deeper into Officer Hunter's reasoning and conduct. There are clearly discrepancies between his testimony and the surveillance footage. Perhaps additional context would." The judge raised a hand, cutting him off. "I agree," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She turned her piercing gaze back to Hunter. "Officer, I expect complete honesty moving forward. Anything less, and this court will have no choice but to consider disciplinary action." Hunter opened his mouth to respond, but his words came out garbled, his earlier bravado replaced with stammered excuses. "I was just trying to ensure public safety," he finally managed, his voice barely audible. Terence resisted the urge to scoff. Public safety. That was the excuse Hunter clung to after all of this. It was almost laughable if it weren't so infuriating. He kept his composure, though, knowing that any outburst now would only play into Hunter's narrative of him being a so-called threat. The prosecutor hesitated before stepping toward the bench. "Your Honor," he said, glancing at Hunter with an unreadable expression, "if I may, I'd like to call for a brief recess. This case warrants further examination, and I believe additional evidence may shed light on the motivations behind Officer Hunter's actions." The judge studied the prosecutor for a moment, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Granted, we will reconvene in 30 minutes. This court is adjourned for recess." The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the room, signaling a pause in the proceedings, but it did nothing to dispel the charged atmosphere. As the courtroom emptied, Terence remained seated, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of every lie that lingered on him, some sympathetic, others curious, a few openly hostile. But he didn't care about the whispers or the stares. His focus was on the prosecutor's vague mention of additional evidence. What could they have uncovered? As the guards approached to escort him back to the holding area, Terence caught a glimpse of Hunter being cornered by his own legal team. Their hushed, urgent tones were a stark contrast to the officer's earlier snugness. He didn't need to hear the words to know they weren't good for Hunter. Back in the holding room, Terence paced, his steps measured but restless. The other detainees had been shuffled to different areas, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The silence gave way to memories he tried to push aside. The humiliation of being cuffed in public, the searing sting of Hunter's condescending smirk, the quiet fear he had buried under layers of practiced calm. But alongside those memories was something stronger. Resolve. He thought about his family, his friends, the colleagues who respected him for his work and his integrity. He thought about every young black man who had been in a similar situation, who hadn't been as fortunate to have cameras rolling or evidence to back up their claims. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about standing up to a system that too often allowed people like Hunter to operate unchecked. The minutes dragged, but eventually the guard returned to escort him back to the courtroom. This time, Terence walked with his head high, shoulders squared. He was tired of playing defensively. It was time to push back. The courtroom was fuller than before, the news of the footage likely drawing in more curious spectators. Hunter was already seated, looking decidedly less composed than earlier. His face was pale, his hands fidgeting with the edges of his uniform. The prosecutor stood beside him, his expression unreadable as he shuffled through a stack of papers. Once everyone was settled, the judge re-entered, her presence commanding as always. "Court is back in session," she announced, her voice firm. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Your Honor," he began, holding up a folder, "during the recess, we reviewed additional evidence related to this case. I'd like to present it to the court now." The judge nodded, gesturing for him to continue. The prosecutor handed a small flash drive to the bailiff, who inserted it into the courtroom's display system. A new video appeared on the screen, this one from a different angle outside the coffee shop. Terence's heart raced as he watched the footage. It showed Hunter lingering in his squad car for several minutes before suddenly exiting and approaching Terence. The context was damning. It was clear Hunter had no immediate cause to confront him. But then, something unexpected happened. The video also showed a brief exchange between Hunter and another officer just before Hunter made his move. The two spoke briefly, their body language tense, before the other officer shook his head and returned to his car. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The new footage didn't just highlight Hunter's actions. It hinted at a deeper story, one involving others in the department. The judge banged her gavel, silencing the room. "Officer Hunter," she said, her tone colder than before, "care to explain this interaction, and why it was not mentioned in your report?" Hunter's face turned a shade paler. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence stretched, every second feeling like an eternity. Finally, he muttered something inaudible. "Speak up, officer," the judge demanded. "This court will not tolerate evasiveness." Hunter's voice cracked as he said, "It was a misunderstanding. The other officer and I disagreed on how to handle the situation." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Disagreed? On what grounds?" Hunter stammered, but before he could dig himself a deeper hole, the prosecutor interjected. "Your Honor, the officer in question has been subpoenaed to testify. He is waiting outside and ready to provide his account." The air in the courtroom grew electric. Terence glanced at Hunter, whose discomfort was now impossible to hide. Whatever the other officer was about to reveal, it wasn't going to help Hunter's case. The judge nodded sharply. "Bring him in." As the door opened and the second officer entered, the room seemed to collectively hold its breath. This new witness, with a calm yet serious demeanor, took the stand and swore his oath. The stage was set for the truth to finally come to light. But as he opened his mouth to speak, Terence felt a mix of anticipation and dread. Whatever came next, it was going to change everything. The second officer adjusted his posture in the witness chair, his face a mask of professionalism, though a hint of unease lingered in his eyes. The courtroom was silent, every ear tuned to what he would say. Terence leaned forward slightly, his instincts telling him that whatever came next would either solidify Hunter's downfall or complicate the situation in ways no one expected. "State your name and rank for the record," the prosecutor began. "Officer James Carter, Senior Patrol Officer," the man replied, his voice steady but clipped. "Officer Carter, can you explain the interaction captured in the video between you and Officer Hunter prior to Mr. King's arrest?" Carter hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes flickering briefly toward Hunter, who sat stiffly at his table, his jaw clenched. The pause wasn't long enough for the judge to intervene, but it was enough to send a ripple of unease through the courtroom. "Officer Hunter and I had a difference of opinion," Carter began cautiously. "When the call came in about a suspicious individual outside the coffee shop, I reviewed the information and determined there was no immediate threat. I advised against any action unless further details emerged." "And how did Officer Hunter respond to your assessment?" The prosecutor pressed. Carter exhaled slowly. "He disagreed. Strongly. He said he had a hunch, and insisted on investigating. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs again, the word hunch sparking a wave of incredulous reactions. The judge's gavel struck sharply. "Order," she commanded. Officer Carter, continue. "Your Honor," Carter said, his voice firmer now, "I made it clear that we should wait for more information." Officer Hunter dismissed my suggestion and proceeded alone. I remained in my vehicle, as I didn't believe the situation warranted escalation. The prosecutor stepped closer, his tone sharpening. "Officer Carter, are you aware of any personal biases that might have influenced Officer Hunter's actions that day?" Hunter's attorney immediately objected, but the judge allowed the question to stand. Carter hesitated, his gaze dropping momentarily. When he looked up again, his expression was resolute. "I can't speak to Officer Hunter's personal beliefs," he said carefully, "but I have observed behavior in the past that raised concerns." Terrence's breath caught. This was the twist he hadn't anticipated, a potential pattern of misconduct. The courtroom murmurs grew louder, despite the judge's repeated calls for order. The prosecutor pounced. "Concerns. Can you elaborate on that, Officer Carter?" Carter glanced at Hunter again, his reluctance evident. There have been instances, he began slowly, where Officer Hunter's actions seemed disproportionately aggressive, particularly in interactions involving black civilians. The words hum in the air like a thunderclap. Hunter visibly tensed, his fists clenching on the table. His attorney immediately sprang to his feet. "Your Honor, this is conjecture." The judge silenced him with a raised hand. "Officer Carter, do you have specific examples to support this statement?" Carter nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I submitted reports on 2 occasions expressing my concerns about Officer Hunter's conduct. Unfortunately, those reports did not result in any action from our department." The room erupted. Journalists scrambled to jot down notes, spectators whispered furiously, and even the prosecutor seemed momentarily stunned by the revelation. The judge's gavel struck repeatedly until the room quieted once more. Terrence's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about him anymore. Carter's testimony hinted at a systemic issue, one that went beyond a single officer. The prosecutor pressed on. "Officer Carter, are you suggesting that there is a pattern of misconduct involving Officer Hunter that the department failed to address?" Hunter's attorney objected again, but the damage was already done. The judge allowed Carter to answer, and he nodded grimly. "Yes," he said simply. "And I believe those failures contributed to what happened to Mr. King." Terrence felt a mix of vindication and anger. Carter's admission was powerful, but it also underscored how deep the rot went. Hunter wasn't just a bad apple, he was a symptom of a larger problem. The judge leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "Officer Carter, your testimony is noted and will be addressed accordingly. This court will determine the next steps regarding the broader implications of your statements. For now, let's focus on the matter at hand." The tension in the room reached a boiling point as the prosecutor pivoted back to Terrence. "Your Honor, this new information reinforces that Mr. King's arrest was not only baseless, but part of a larger pattern of abuse. We'll ask the court to consider this when determining any disciplinary actions against Officer Hunter." Hunter's attorney launched into a fervent defense, painting Hunter as a dedicated officer who made an error in judgment under pressure. But the weight of Carter's testimony and the damning surveillance footage seemed to overshadow his arguments. As the judge called for another recess to review the new evidence and testimony, Terrence was escorted back to the holding area. This time he felt a flicker of hope. The truth was unraveling, piece by piece, and Hunter's carefully constructed facade was crumbling. But as he sat alone, the weight of Carter's words lingered. This wasn't over. If anything, it had just become bigger than he ever imagined. Hunter's actions were part of a much larger story, one that demanded answers and accountability. Terrence knew that the next chapter wouldn't just determine his own fate, it would shine a light on a system long overdue for change. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as everyone reconvened after the recess. The judge, now armed with all the evidence and testimony, wore an expression of quiet authority. Officer Hunter's once confident demeanor had disintegrated. His posture slouched, his gaze darting nervously around the room. Terence sat upright, his expression calm but resolute, knowing the next moments would determine more than just his personal vindication. The judge began, her tone sharp and measured. After reviewing the surveillance footage, Officer Carter's testimony, and the reports submitted to this court, it is clear that this case extends beyond a single incident. This trial has revealed deeper issues of bias and abuse of power, which this court cannot and will not ignore. Hunter's attorney stood abruptly, attempting to interrupt, but the judge silenced him with a curt glance. "Sit down, counselor. Your client's conduct speaks for itself." The room fell silent as the judge turned her attention to Terence. "Mr. King, you've been subjected to an egregious abuse of power. I apologize on behalf of this court for what you've endured. The charges against you are officially dismissed. You're free to go." Terence exhaled, the weight of the ordeal momentarily lifting, but the judge wasn't finished. She shifted her gaze to Officer Hunter, who looked like he was shrinking under her scrutiny. "Officer Hunter, your behavior was not only unprofessional, but unlawful. This court recommends immediate disciplinary action, including suspension without pay, pending a full investigation. Furthermore, the evidence and testimony presented today will be forwarded to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal charges." The words hit like a thunderclap. Hunter's face went pale, and his attorney whispered frantically in his ear. The gallery erupted into murmurs, many clearly satisfied that justice was finally catching up with the arrogant officer. But just as the tension seemed to ease, the prosecutor rose again, a new piece of evidence in hand. "Your Honor, if I may, there's one more detail that deserves the court's attention." Terence froze, his heart racing. "What now?" The prosecutor held up a file. "During the investigation, we uncovered internal emails from the police department. These communications suggest that Officer Hunter was specifically targeting individuals based on their race, and in Mr. King's case, he was aware of Mr. King's federal position before the arrest." Gasps rippled through the room. Terence's jaw tightened. Hunter knew the arrest hadn't been a random act of prejudice or arrogance. It had been deliberate. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Is this true, Officer Hunter?" she demanded. Hunter's attorney stood again, scrambling to minimize the damage. "Your Honor, these emails are circumstantial and—" "I asked Officer Hunter," the judge interrupted coldly. Hunter's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, it seemed he might deny it, but the weight of the evidence was too heavy. "I didn't know who he was until after I started questioning him," he stammered, though the explanation sounded feeble even to him. "It wasn't personal." The judge's expression darkened. "Targeting an individual based on race and abusing your authority is personal, Officer Hunter. This court will not tolerate such behavior." Terence felt a surge of anger and vindication, but there was something else, something gnawing at the back of his mind. The revelation about the emails hinted at a broader conspiracy. If Hunter had known who Terence was, who else had been involved? As the judge delivered her final remarks, outlining the next steps for the investigation, Terence's thoughts raced. This wasn't just about one officer going rogue. The emails suggested a culture of complicity, one that would take more than a single trial to dismantle. As the court adjourned, Terence was met with a flurry of reporters outside. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward him, and voices clamored for his reaction. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before stepping forward. "Today is a step in the right direction," he said firmly, "but it's only the beginning. This isn't just about me. It's about a system that needs accountability and reform. I won't stop until we see real change." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, but Terence's focus remained clear. As he walked away, flanked by his attorney and supporters, he glanced back at the courthouse. Officer Hunter might have been exposed, but the fight was far from over, and Terence was ready for whatever came next. In the distance, Hunter was being escorted out of the courthouse, his face a mask of humiliation. For a fleeting moment their eyes met. Hunter looked away first, his defeat unmistakable. But for Terence, this wasn't just about winning. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what he had. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The system had underestimated him, and now it was his turn to hold it accountable.